Keep the $500,000, Graham Ellis said, sliding the check back across the scarred counter. You owe me 15. Audrey Whittaker stared at him as if the numbers had stopped making sense. Outside, rain whispered against the metal roof of Ellis Auto. Behind them, a Highland green 1967 Mustang fastback idled with a deep, uneven warmth that seemed too alive for a car that had spent nearly a year being declared impossible. The vibration traveled through the old concrete floor. A faint metallic tick hid inside the exhaust note. The man standing across from her had done it with grease under his nails, an old red toolbox, and a part that cost $15. Audrey pushed the check toward him again. $500,000, she said. That was my promise. Graham looked down at the number. His work shirt was frayed at one cuff. His truck outside had 200,000 miles on it. A red final notice envelope sat face down beside the register. His 8-year-old daughter, Nora, stood near the office doorway with both hands wrapped around the straps of her backpack. $500,000 could change almost every practical problem in his life. He still did not touch the check. I know what you promised. Then take it. No. Dean Holloway, Audrey's financial advisor, stood near the open bay with his arms folded. 3 days earlier, he had looked at Ellis Auto as if the building itself were an insult. Now even he said nothing. Audrey's voice dropped. You brought back the one thing everyone else told me I had already lost. Graham turned toward the Mustang. On the passenger seat rested a black and white photograph of Henry Whittaker, smiling beside the same car decades earlier. The part was $15, Graham said. Audrey's jaw tightened. That is not what I am paying you for. Graham reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small white invoice. He placed it beside the check. Ignition condenser, $15. Under labor, he had written 2 words in blue ink. Paid already. Audrey read them twice. Paid by who? Graham looked toward Henry's photograph. For one long second, the garage held only the rain, the old engine, and the fluorescent buzz. Overhead. Then Graham said, Your father. Audrey froze. Henry Whittaker had been dead for 11 months. Graham had never told her they had met. And suddenly the $15 invoice felt heavier than the $500,000 check. 3 days earlier, Graham Ellis had never seen Audrey Whittaker in his life. On the counter behind her sat 3 envelopes Graham had not opened in front of her. Electric bill. Property insurance. Final notice from the equipment lender. He turned them face down. Then the tow truck arrived. It looked absurdly expensive against the cracked lot. A black sedan followed it through the open gate, tires hissing over wet pavement. The flatbed stopped in front of the first bay carrying a car beneath a fitted gray cover. Nora abandoned her spelling words and pressed closer to the office window. That is definitely expensive, she whispered. A woman in a charcoal coat stepped from the sedan. Audrey Whittaker moved with the controlled precision of someone used to entering rooms where everyone already knew why she mattered. Dean Holloway climbed out after her carrying a leather folder and the expression of a man who had already decided this was a mistake. Audrey stopped in front of Graham. Graham Ellis? Depends who is asking. Dean did not smile. Audrey almost did. I was told you restore old engines. Graham looked toward the covered car. Sometimes. Dean opened the folder. The vehicle has already been examined by specialists in Chicago, Columbus, and Louisville. None would guarantee the original engine. Then why bring it here? Dean glanced at the faded sign above the garage. A retired mechanic outside Plainfield gave us your name. Graham frowned. Who? He did not ask for credit. That usually means he knows me. He said you would either refuse the job or be the only man stubborn enough to do it correctly. That got Graham's attention. Audrey stepped toward the flatbed. It belonged to my father. The driver released the straps and pulled away the cover. Morning light moved across Highland green paint, faded chrome, and the long fastback roofline of a 1967 Mustang. Graham stopped wiping his hands. Nora came to the bay entrance. Wow! Graham opened the hood. The engine compartment did not look original. Newer wiring lived beside older repairs. Fresh hardware sat near brackets that had clearly been handmade decades earlier. Expensive restoration work had been layered over somebody else's habits. Dean handed Graham the reports. 11 specialists. Graham barely looked at the first page. Start it. Audrey blinked. You want to hear it? Once. She climbed behind the wheel and turned the key. The starter dragged with a heavy, ugly hesitation. Graham's hand shot up. Stop. Audrey released the key immediately. Dean frowned. Every other shop attempted multiple starts. And every other shop sent it back. Graham leaned over the engine bay and listened to the silence after the failed attempt. Then his flashlight stopped on a section of wiring near the firewall where 2 letters had been scratched into the metal by hand. HW beside them, an old cloth-wrapped wire had darkened with age. Do not start it again, Graham said. Audrey stepped out. Why? Because that starter did not just sound weak. Something pulled it down. If I keep asking the engine to turn before I know why, I could turn a reparable problem into an expensive one. Dean gave a dry laugh. The engine is already expensive. Graham looked at him. That is exactly the kind of sentence that gets original engines replaced. Dean's expression hardened. Audrey stepped between them with her eyes still on the Mustang. Can you fix it? I do not know. Dean closed the folder. Then this is wasting time. Graham lowered the hood halfway. That may be true. Audrey stared at him. You are not going to promise me anything? Not yet. Everyone else promised. Graham nodded toward the silent Mustang. How did that work out? The words should have offended her. Instead, Audrey looked at the car. What do you need? Time. And nobody turns that key without asking me first. Dean started to object. Audrey stopped him with one look. He gets until tomorrow morning. Graham glanced at her. That is not much time. My father's birthday is Thursday. I wanted to drive this car that morning. There it was. Not just money. A deadline with grief behind it. Graham looked at the hand-scratched initials again. Then I will tell you what I know by tomorrow morning. Not what you want to hear. By noon, the Mustang sat inside the second bay with its hood raised beneath pale fluorescent lights. Graham photographed every connection before touching it. He labeled old hardware. He placed small parts on clean white towels. Nothing left the car without a reason. Audrey stayed longer than Dean expected. You do this with every car? She asked. Only the ones people care about. That must be most of them. Graham looked at a rusted washer in his palm. You would be surprised. Dean checked his watch. We have a transport company on standby. If you find nothing by 9 tomorrow, the Mustang goes back to Indianapolis. Graham did not look up. Fine. That does not bother you. Should it? There is a $500,000 success fee attached to this repair. Graham finally turned. Not from me. Dean studied him. Everybody says that before the number becomes real. Graham returned to the wiring. Then maybe stop talking long enough to find out whether I am everybody. Audrey's mouth almost curved into a smile. Near 3, Graham left to pick Nora up from school. She returned carrying a permission slip and a carton of chocolate milk. Dad, the Science Museum trip is Friday. I remember. It is $48. I remember that too. Nora looked toward the envelopes beside the register. Children noticed what adults worked hardest to hide. It is okay if I do not go. Graham stopped moving. No. It is not. I mean, it is only a museum. You have been talking about the space exhibit for 3 weeks. She shrugged too casually. The pictures online are probably the same. Graham crouched in front of her. You are going. Promise? He looked at the final notice on the counter, then back at his daughter. Promise. She smiled because she trusted him. That trust cost more than $48. Near sunset, Audrey returned alone. She found Graham beneath the Mustang, work light on the concrete beside him. You have been here all day. Most days work that way. Audrey glanced toward the office, where Nora had fallen asleep with her cheek against an open library book. I want to make this simple, Audrey said. $25,000 if you can have it running by my father's birthday. Graham slid out from beneath the car. I have not told you I can fix it. $50,000. That does not change what I know. $100,000. The garage seemed to shrink around the number. You need the money. A lot of people do. Then let me pay you. For what? For succeeding. I have not succeeded. A voice came from the bay entrance. You have not even diagnosed it. Dean had returned. He stepped inside carrying another folder. Everyone has a number, Mr. Ellis. Graham stood. Then you have met the wrong people. Dean gave a humorless smile. Or I have met enough people. Audrey turned toward him. Dean. You flew experts across 3 states. You approved $180,000 in work. Now we are standing in a 2-bay garage while a man who cannot keep his own compressor alive tells us patience is a diagnostic strategy. He closed his toolbox. Audrey stared at him. What are you doing? Ending the part where I am paid to be insulted. Dean blinked. You have not been paid anything. Exactly. Graham lifted the toolbox. Audrey stepped in front of him. Please. He stopped. Not because she was wealthy. Because there was no command in her voice now. Only fear. My father would not let anyone modernize this car, Audrey said. Every shop eventually told me the same thing. Replace the old ignition. Replace the engine controls. Replace whatever they could not explain. I kept saying no until they stopped answering my calls. Graham looked toward the Mustang. Then why did you bring it here? Because the retired mechanic who recommended you said one thing I could not forget. What? Audrey swallowed. He said, Graham Ellis knows the difference between fixing something and erasing it. Graham slowly set the toolbox back down. I still want his name. So do I, Audrey said. Dean took the call. Dean's expression changed just enough for Graham to notice. Later, Dean said. Graham looked at him for a long moment. Then he reopened the toolbox. 9 tomorrow morning, he said. After that, take the car wherever you want. The next day began before sunrise. Graham arrived at 5:47 and found Audrey sitting beside the Mustang with a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. You sleep here? He asked. Almost. She pointed toward the scratched initials near the firewall. I asked my mother about H.W. Graham set down his toolbox. And? Henry Whitaker. My father scratched them there when he was 23. He worked on the car himself. Before the company, yes. Apparently all the time. Graham looked at her. You did not know? Audrey smiled without humor. I knew my father as the man with drivers, assistants, board meetings, and people who opened doors before he reached them. My mother knew the man who slept in cheap motels and rebuilt carburetors in parking lots. Graham turned toward the Mustang. Cars remember earlier versions of people. Audrey said nothing. For the next hour, Graham uncovered hand-soldered connections, a homemade throttle bracket, and an old repair hidden beneath newer restoration work. At 7:30, Nora arrived after a neighbor dropped her off before school. She carried her backpack and immediately asked if she could help. Graham handed her a flashlight. "Only where I point." "I know." He began loosening the passenger seat to inspect wiring routed beneath it. Nora crouched beside him. "There is something under there." Graham shifted the seat forward. A yellowed receipt lay folded around a faded Polaroid. Audrey stepped closer. The photograph showed a young Henry beside the Mustang at an old roadside gas station. Another young man stood beside him, partly washed out by sunlight. Audrey turned it over. 7 words were written on the back. "For the man who stopped when nobody else did." "What does that mean?" Audrey asked. Graham was staring at the gas station sign in the background. "Briggs." Something moved behind his eyes. "Not recognition exactly. The edge of one." "I know that road," he said. Dean arrived at 8:59. He looked at the Mustang, then the clock. "Time." Audrey did not move. "He found something." Dean looked at the Polaroid. "A photograph is not a diagnosis." Graham reached into the engine bay and removed a small cylindrical component. "This is." He placed the ignition condenser beneath a magnifying lamp. The casing was old. The connection showed evidence of heat. The specification stamped into the metal was barely readable. Graham tested it once. Then again. The meter needle hesitated where it should not. "Failed condenser," he said. Dean stared at the part. That may be enough." "How much?" $15 if I can find the correct one." Dean actually laughed. "We spent $180,000. Graham looked at him. "That did not make the car run." "And you think a $15 part will?" "I think the car does not care what anybody spent." Audrey looked at the Polaroid, then the condenser. "Can you replace it without changing anything else?" "If I find the right specification." "Then do it." Dean stepped forward. "Audrey, no. We already have a proposal to install a modern ignition system. It would solve this entire category of problems." Audrey's eyes hardened. "My father said no." "Your father is not here." The garage went completely still. Dean knew the mistake the moment the words left his mouth. Audrey's face changed. Graham did not raise his voice. "That is why the people who are still here have to be careful what they erase." Dean looked away. Audrey picked up the condenser. $15, she said. "Find it." Graham called 4 parts stores. Nothing. He called a restoration supplier in Ohio. Wrong specification. He called a collector in Fort Wayne. Used only. At 10:30, the tow driver called Dean asking whether he should return. Dean said yes. Audrey heard him. "Cancel it. We are out of time." Then we change the time. "Your father's birthday is tomorrow." "Exactly." Dean lowered his voice. "Do not let grief turn this into superstition." Audrey looked at the Mustang. "And do not let efficiency turn it into something my father would not recognize." Graham kept dialing. Nora, sitting near the office, looked at the Polaroid again. "Dad." "Yeah. Does Briggs mean anything?" Graham covered the receiver. "Maybe. Grandma used to talk about a Briggs Road." Graham looked at her. A memory moved closer. Summer heat. His mother's old sedan. A gas station sign. A man laughing beside a green car. Not enough. But close. He unfolded the yellowed receipt from beneath the seat. An address was written near the bottom. 18 miles west. Graham found an old county directory taped beside his shop phone and dialed a number. No answer. He tried another. Then another. Finally an elderly voice came through. Briggs' residence. Graham straightened. Is this Walter Briggs? A pause. Who is asking? Graham Ellis. I am working on a 1967 Mustang that belonged to Henry Whittaker. Silence. Then the old man's voice changed. Henry's Mustang? Graham looked at Audrey. Yes, sir. Highland Green? Yes. Another pause. Do not replace anything. I am coming. Graham frowned. You know the car? Walter gave a tired little laugh. Son, I knew that car before Henry knew what $1 million looked like. Graham looked toward Dean. Did you recommend me? Dean's face tightened. Walter answered before Dean could. I gave your name to a man from the Whittaker family office 2 weeks ago. The room went silent. Graham gripped the phone harder. Why? Walter's answer came quietly. Because Henry once told me about a boy named Graham Ellis. And because I drove past your shop last year and saw that name over the door. I did not know if you were the same boy. I hoped you were. Graham stopped breathing for half a second. Audrey slowly sat down. There is a photograph, Walter said. Briggs Station. Henry. The Mustang. Graham looked at the Polaroid. I have it. Then wait for me. There is something you need to hear before that engine starts. Walter Briggs arrived 42 minutes later in an old beige pickup with a dented toolbox beside him. He moved slowly into Ellis Auto, leaning on a cane. But the moment he saw the Mustang, something in his face became young again. He removed his cap. Well, Henry, he whispered. You finally found him. Audrey stepped forward. You knew my father. Before most people knew his name. Walter picked up the faded Polaroid. 1978. My station outside Plainfield. Your father had more confidence than money and more mechanical sense than patience. Audrey gave a small, broken laugh. That sounds like him. Walter turned the picture over and read the words. For the man who stopped when nobody else did. His expression softened. Graham stepped closer. Who was the man who stopped? Walter looked directly at him. Henry was. He opened his toolbox and removed an old photograph sealed inside a plastic sleeve. It showed a rural highway in summer. Henry stood beside the green Mustang. Near the shoulder was a tired woman and a skinny teenage boy holding a cheap toolbox against his chest. Graham's hands went cold. Nora looked at him. Dad? The woman in the picture was Graham's mother. The boy was Graham. Memory returned all at once. He was 16. His father had been dead 8 months. His mother was working double shifts and driving a sedan that overheated whenever the weather got hot. That afternoon, it had died on the side of the road. Cars passed. Trucks passed. His mother had $12 in her purse and no one to call. Then a green Mustang stopped. A man in rolled sleeves got out. He did not ask what they could pay. He opened the hood. He fixed the problem with tools from his trunk. Graham remembered standing beside him, watching every movement. You were that boy, Audrey whispered. Graham nodded slowly. I never knew his name. Walter did. Henry told me about you that night. Said you watched his hands like the repair mattered more than being scared. Graham looked toward the old red toolbox beneath his bench. Another memory came back. Henry noticing the cheap wrench set Graham carried. Henry opening the Mustang's trunk. Henry handing him a worn set of professional tools. Graham had tried to refuse. The stranger had smiled. If you ever get good at fixing things, Henry had said, help somebody who cannot pay you back. Graham walked to his toolbox and lifted one of the old wrenches he had used for 20 years. Audrey stared at it. Those were my father's. They were mine the moment he gave them to me. But yes. Audrey looked at her father's Mustang, then at Graham's garage, then at Nora. All her life she had measured Henry's legacy in buildings, company shares, scholarships, and names engraved on walls. Yet one anonymous stop on one ordinary road had helped create the man standing in front of her. Dean lowered his eyes. "Walter," Graham said, "why did you recommend me and not tell them why?" Walter smiled faintly. "Because if I told a billionaire's daughter that her father once rescued the mechanic I wanted her to hire, she might bring you the car out of sentiment. I wanted her to bring it because you were good enough." Graham looked at him. "And if I was not the same Graham Ellis? Then I still would have recommended a good mechanic." Walter reached into his toolbox and pulled out a small cardboard box. "You said condenser on the phone." Graham opened it. Inside was an old stock replacement in the exact specification Henry had used. "Where did you get this?" "My parts cabinet. I throw away less than my wife would like." For the first time in 2 days, Graham smiled. By late afternoon, Henry Whitaker's birthday was only hours away. Graham worked with Walter beside him and Nora watching from a safe distance. He removed the failed condenser. He cleaned the original connection. He checked the old wiring against Henry's handwritten marks. He used the worn wrench Henry had given him 20 years earlier. Dean stayed. He no longer checked his phone. When Graham lowered the hood, the entire garage seemed to hold its breath. "That is everything," he said. Audrey looked at him. "You are sure?" No mechanic who respects an old car is completely sure before the key turns. Dean glanced toward the Mustang. "That is not comforting. It is honest." Graham handed the keys to Audrey. She stared at them. "You start it." "Why me?" "Because he gave the car to you." Audrey climbed into the driver's seat. Her hands rested on the steering wheel where her father's hands had rested for decades. She turned the key. The starter moved once. Heavy. Nothing. Her face fell. Dean shifted near the bay door. Walter did not move. Graham listened. Again. Audrey tried a second time. The engine turned, coughed, and almost caught. Then silence. Dean stepped forward. "Stop." Audrey looked at him. "We have already done this too many times." Graham leaned into the engine bay and checked the connection one final time. His pulse had climbed, but his voice stayed level. "The bowls have been dry. The battery has been through repeated tests. It is closer than it sounds." Dean shook his head. "Or the $15 miracle was wrong." Graham looked at Audrey. Nora looked at her father. Audrey did too. "Then why try again?" she asked. Graham listened to the quiet car. "Because the second attempt told me something the first did not. It tried to fire." Walter nodded once. Dean folded his arms. "And if the third attempt damages it?" Graham shook his head. "Then we do not make a third attempt." Audrey looked surprised. "You just said it was close." "Close is not permission. It is your car. Your father's engine. Your risk." He stepped back from the Mustang. She looked at Walter. "What would my father do?" Walter smiled sadly. "He would listen to the mechanic he trusted. Then he would make his own decision. Usually the stubborn one." Audrey laughed through the fear. She looked at Graham. "Do you believe one more attempt is safe?" "Yes." "Then one more." Her fingers closed around the key. She turned it. The starter engaged. 1 rotation. 2. The engine caught, stumbled, nearly died, then came alive. A deep V8 rumble filled Ellis' auto. Nora grabbed the edge of the workbench. Walter removed his cap. Dean slowly lowered his arms. Graham did not move. The Mustang settled into the uneven idle Audrey had heard through her bedroom wall as a child. Then came the sound. Tick. 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 Audrey's hand rose to her mouth. The clock, she whispered. Graham could barely hear her over the engine. What? Tears filled her eyes. He called that little metallic tick the car's stubborn clock. He said if it ever disappeared, the car was pretending to be someone else. Walter laughed softly. That sounds like Henry. Audrey pressed the accelerator once. The engine answered cleanly. She closed her eyes. For one moment she was not Audrey Whittaker, chairwoman of a foundation or heir to a fortune. She was a little girl waiting at the top of the stairs for her father to tap the horn twice. When she switched off the engine, the silence felt nothing like failure. It felt earned. Dean walked toward Graham. I owe you an apology. Graham began putting away his tools. You owe the car one. Dean almost smiled. Fair enough. Audrey walked to the counter, opened her purse, and removed a prepared check. $500,000. She placed it in front of Graham. You earned this. Graham looked at the check. Then at Nora. Her Science Museum form was still tucked into the front pocket of her backpack. He thought about the final notice. The roof. The compressor. The truck. He picked up the check. Audrey exhaled as if relieved. Dean nodded once. Nora watched her father. Graham held the check for several seconds. Then he slid it back. Keep it. Audrey stared at him. Graham. He pulled a small invoice from beneath the register. Ignition condenser, $15. Under labor, he wrote 2 words. Paid already. You owe me 15. Audrey looked at the invoice, then at Henry's old wrench beside it. Paid by who? Graham turned toward the Mustang. Your father. 20 years ago. He stopped when nobody else did. He fixed our car. He gave me tools. He gave me a direction when I did not have one. Audrey shook her head. That does not mean your work today has no value. I did not say it had no value. Then let me pay you for it. Graham nodded toward the $500,000 check. That is not payment for a repair. That is grief trying to put a number on hearing your father again. Audrey went still. Graham's voice softened. I know what that feels like. After my father died, people kept trying to fix my mother and me by giving us advice, giving us things, taking things away, telling us to move on. Henry did something simpler. He stopped. Nora listened without moving. If I take $500,000 for returning one sound to you, Graham continued, then I turn the best thing your father ever gave me into a transaction. I cannot do that. Audrey looked down at the check. You have a daughter. You need money. Yes. Your roof leaks. Yes. Your compressor is dying. Also yes. Then this is pride. Graham considered that. Maybe some of it is. But dignity is not refusing every dollar, he said. Dignity is knowing which dollars you earned and which ones came from somebody's pain. He tapped the $15 invoice. This is what I am charging today. If you need me again, I will charge you like any other customer. Audrey looked toward Nora. And what do you want your daughter to learn from this? Graham did not answer immediately. Nora did. That dad is terrible at becoming rich. Walter laughed first. Even Dean did. Graham looked at Nora. Accurate. Then he turned back to Audrey. I want her to know that getting paid fairly matters. So does knowing when money is not the point. Audrey folded the check once and put it away. Then she took $15 from her wallet and placed it on the counter. Graham looked at the bills. You have exact change. I came prepared to argue with you. That part worked. 3 weeks later, the sign above Ellis Auto was still crooked. The coffee maker still complained every morning. Graham still opened before sunrise. But on a bright Monday afternoon, Audrey arrived without Dean, without a driver, and without another check. She carried a plain blue folder. Nora was sitting near the office finishing homework. Is my dad in trouble? She asked. Audrey smiled. Actually, I think he is about to get more work. Graham emerged from beneath an old pickup and wiped his hands. If this is about the Mustang, it is running fine. It is not about the Mustang. Audrey placed the folder on his workbench. Inside were plans Henry had drafted years earlier for a vocational program designed for teenagers from struggling families, especially young people who had lost a parent or needed a second chance. The project had never opened. Henry died before approving the final property purchase. Graham turned the pages slowly. Why are you showing me this? Because Walter told me something after we left that night. Graham looked up. What? My father checked on you twice after he stopped for you and your mother. Not directly. He asked Walter whether the boy with the toolbox had found work. Years later he asked again. Walter told him you had become a mechanic. Graham looked toward Henry's old wrench hanging above the workbench. Audrey continued. My father never knew you owned this garage. He never knew you became a single dad. But he knew the kid he helped kept fixing things. Graham swallowed. Why did Walter not tell me? He thought Henry's kindness mattered more if it stayed kindness. No debt. No audience. Audrey opened the folder to the final page. The Whitaker Foundation will fund the building, tools, insurance, and scholarships. You would run the workshop, choose the instructors, and design the training. Your garage stays yours. Your name stays above the door. You receive a salary based on the job. Standard contract. No gift. No sympathy. Graham closed the folder. And if I say no? I find someone else. Good answer. Audrey smiled. I have been learning. He opened the folder again. At the top of the proposal was a name. Henry Whitaker Second Chance Workshop. Graham stared at it. Was that your idea? The program was his. The name is mine. He might have hated having his name on it. Walter said the same thing. Walter is smart. Annoyingly. Graham read every page. He crossed out one clause that gave the foundation too much control over student selection. He changed another that allowed marketing teams to film students without individual permission. Then he handed the folder back. Now I can sign it. Audrey looked at the edits. You negotiate harder over a fair salary than you did over $500,000. Graham looked toward Nora. This is business. And the Mustang? He glanced at Henry's wrench. That was a debt I was happy to keep. 6 months later, the building behind Ellis Auto opened on a cold Monday morning. There were no television cameras. No giant ribbon. No speech from Audrey. 12 students arrived carrying notebooks, work gloves, nervous smiles, and more uncertainty than experience. Some had lost parents. Some had been suspended from school. Some simply could not afford technical training anywhere else. Graham greeted everyone by name. Dean visited once to sign foundation paperwork and surprised Graham by bringing coffee. Walter came every Thursday and criticized everyone's carburetor work. Equally. Audrey visited more often than the program required. Sometimes she brought paperwork. Sometimes she brought the Mustang. Sometimes she brought no reason at all. One evening, sunlight turned the garage windows gold while a 17-year-old student stood over an old sedan belonging to a woman who could not afford the full repair. "Mr. Ellis?" Graham looked up. "Yeah. Why are we doing this one for free?" Across the lot, Henry's Highland green Mustang rested beneath the evening light. Audrey stood near the doorway. Nora sat on the workbench finishing homework. Walter was pretending not to listen. Graham looked at the student. "Because somebody stopped for me once." The boy nodded and returned to the engine. Audrey's eyes moved toward her father's Mustang. Henry Whittaker had stopped beside one broken car more than 20 years earlier and changed a boy's future without a contract, without a camera, and without knowing what would come of it. That boy became a mechanic. Then a father. Then the man teaching 12 other young people how to make themselves useful when someone else's world broke down. Kindness had traveled farther than money ever could. It crossed years, grief, 2 families, 1 old toolbox, and a $15 part before finding its way home. Above Graham's workbench, framed behind glass, hung the small white invoice from the Mustang repair. Ignition condenser, $15. Paid already. Nora once asked why he kept it. Graham looked at the invoice, then through the open bay at Henry's Mustang. "So I remember what things cost," he said. Nora frowned. $15. Graham smiled. "No. What they are worth." Outside, Audrey turned the key. The Mustang started on the first try. A deep rumble rolled across the lot. Then, underneath it, came the faint metallic tick of Henry Whittaker's stubborn little clock. Still keeping time.